So welcome to this week's Diffusion Live. This week, we've got Richard Kim of Galaxy Interactive, partner at Galaxy Interactive, talking about the convergence of gaming and Web3. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thanks, Jamie. Good to be on.
So we've got a relatively short one today, just under half an hour. And what we're going to do is firstly get an introduction to yourself, to Galaxy Interactive. By a number of measures, you are the most active VC in gaming, and I guess specifically as a subset of that, blockchain gaming. So really we want to understand the thesis of Galaxy. I know it's very developed and nuanced, and then you're going to kind of bring that to life by showcasing your thesis through some of your portfolio companies. And then hopefully if we get time, we're going to understand the kind of rationale and reasoning behind those investments, as well as some projections looking forward into 2021 and beyond. So really over to you, Richard. At a high level, as I said, it'd be great to understand a little bit about you as an individual first before we go into Galaxy Interactive.
Yeah, so my partner Sam Engelbart and I run Galaxy Interactive, which over the last 12 to 24 months, we've been one of the most active gaming VCs in the world. One of my favorite websites to track this for those interested in the space is investgame.net. There's a lot of really up-to-date news on kind of gaming deal flow and trends, so I highly recommend that site. It's an interesting space because gaming is now a $160 billion a year market, probably more this year in a post-COVID world. And yet there's not a lot of sector-focused VCs looking at the space. Recently there's been a lot more generalist VCs, starting to dip their toes into gaming, thinking it's an interesting trend, particularly as it relates to kind of social and social fintech, social gaming, social commerce, all of the social whatever. A16Z just actually put out a really good series on social, just kind of laying out the new landscape of consumer social generally. So it's great to be in gaming, which has always been inherently a kind of social phenomenon. But with the rise of gaming as a service and kind of live operations, and when you look at the top 10 games, they're all like 10 years old basically. So there's this kind of disconnect between how investors largely think of gaming, which is as a hit-driven business, almost like film financing, and the realities of what's actually happened, which is a high degree of recurring revenues, pretty modelable kind of trends on kind of user retention, conversion, this sort of thing. And so increasingly, you can analyze business just like a gaming as a business, just like a SaaS business for the really mature franchises. And so from our standpoint, we're not afraid of content. I think my personal view is sometimes you hear generalist VCs saying, oh, we think content is too hit driven. We don't like investing in content, but we like picks and shovels and platforms and these things that are fashionable for VCs to say. And I think that perspective is a bit silly, to be frank, because some of the biggest platforms in gaming have come out of the content side of things. And so what we look for is this mix between interactive content, interactive social, and interactive technology in terms of what are going to be the next platforms that enable the next wave of interactive content. If mobile led the last massive growth spurt in gaming over the last 10 years, what's the next thing going to be? Is it blockchain? Is it cloud gaming? Is it AR, VR? And so, really to understand this space, we feel sector focus is just absolutely critical.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about from the content perspective. I've heard the term content as the platform, and I think perhaps that's increasingly true when we're thinking about an open metaverse, one where you have kind of high degrees of portability. Hopefully that's something we can talk about a little bit later. So I believe you're just going to walk us through a deck which outlines the thesis and then highlight some of the investments that you made and help us understand the rationale behind those.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you guys see my deck that I'm screen
We've
sharing
got
right
it.
now?
We've got it.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, so just at a high level, in terms of why we're looking at this space, our broad thesis is that gaming is a fundamentally healthy force that can bring together people and mitigate these feelings of isolation and hopelessness. In this world where despite being super connected, like there's the Netflix documentary on kind of social networks. I think it's called The Social Dilemma. I mean, that's really the problem statement this day and age of this world that's hyper connected, and yet because we're kind of optimizing for this instant gratification through kind of likes and other status symbols, like there's this feeling of being incredibly alone, right? So one of the things we look for is how the social experience you see in gaming can actually bring people together, right? And this divide between this fake digital world and the real physical world, these lines are actually blurring more than ever before. And so, that's already the case. This is not me kind of predicting the future 10 years from now, right? Gaming is already, the virtual goods market in gaming is already, multi tens of billions, hundreds of billions size market. And so I think COVID has really accelerated the recognition of how real the digital world really is and how it actually can bring us much closer together than ever before. So, for those who aren't familiar with Matt Ball, he's put out some really great content on why gaming is essentially taking over relative to the old like pay TV and traditional forms of entertainment. So what we do is, like I was saying earlier, we play the space through this mix of technology, social, and content, where we have this split in our portfolio. We've deployed about 160 million of our fund. And about 50% of that is in the content space. So think game studios here, as well as other forms of interactive content. Social, which to us means this intersection between gaming and gaming culture and social networks more broadly and consumer markets more broadly. And interactive tech that we think is going to power the next wave of expansion in the market. When you look at our portfolio, most of our investments generally fall into one of these 7 buckets here. I don't think we're going to have time to go through everything, but this deck is public. You can find it on my LinkedIn or probably in the show notes. And yeah, I mean, really, we play we play the space across sectors, so that we have approximately 15% of our investments at the seed stage, about 50% in the Series A, about 25% in Series B, and maybe a handful of deals after that. And so just to, I guess, talk through a couple of these, this idea of social sandboxes is pretty interesting. What you see, as I was alluding to earlier, are these gaming franchises that when you look at Grand Theft Auto, for example, GTA has now sold more than 250 million copies and grossed more than $15 billion across its lifetime of franchises. And a lot of that growth is continuing in the form of these sandbox worlds of GTA Online, and so like this mix between traditional interactive narrative, like your Cyberpunk 2077 type of, I'm going to play through this game 25 hours, and once I'm done, I'm kind of done with it, and like the sandbox world of user-generated content that keeps the world fresh and new, kind of more like Roblox. Like these two worlds are kind of coming together in interesting ways. We just co-led a Series B with NetEase in a company called Build a Rocket Boy, founded by Leslie Benzies, who's actually the key creative behind GTA. And the creative concept is really interesting. It's like real life Ready Player One, where you have that 7-chapter Star Wars-like epic narrative, that's going to come out over multiple years. But you also have this sandbox element of this world that people that the characters in the game, quote, escape to. And so they're literally putting these like VR goggles on as part of the narrative in the game. And that world that the characters escape to in the game is a sandbox world where players can actually create their own worlds using a lot of the art assets from the kind of traditional epic narrative side of things. So just this combination between cross-play, content that constantly gets refreshed between what the users are bringing into the world, and then that kind of top-down, like really immersive, compelling narrative in the form of gameplay. I think these two worlds are going to come together, and really powered by what the cloud has enabled in terms of just massive open worlds, and the horizontal scalability that kind of cloud and other technologies are bringing. I think one other technology that we're quite constructive is blockchain. Galaxy Interactive has its roots as a blockchain firm, given that our parent company Galaxy Digital is essentially that institutional bridge between traditional finance and all the amazing innovation we're seeing in crypto. Crypto has a pretty bad reputation in the gaming space. If you talk to mainstream game designers, like I'd say 99% of them, maybe that's somewhat of an exaggeration, but probably not very much, have a negative view of the idea of crypto games, just because we haven't seen that mainstream hit yet. But I think we're still in the very early stages of this, right? I think there's the whole put your virtual goods on a blockchain application of crypto that I think is pretty interesting. And we have a portfolio company, Mythical Games, that has a game called Blankos that has just hit open beta. They've already had over 100,000 registered accounts. I think the gameplay is fantastic, and it's one of these worlds that based on the exponential pace of like UGC development you see, it'll just get better and better over time as additional races, battle arenas and things get built. So that's pretty exciting. And to have that kind of mainstream distribution in the context of a blockchain game, we just haven't seen yet, right? And so that's why, like, I'm quite keen not to judge this as if it were a completed ball game, when in reality we're still in the first inning of what's going on here. And a lot of the friction that crypto has traditionally brought with it in terms of fiat gateways, KYC, ML issues, all this kind of stuff. Solutions are developing on the infrastructure side as well on this. So yeah, I think we're quite constructive. The virtual goods hypothesis. The other area of crypto that's really fascinated me is the whole social token space. We just made a small seed investment in Roll, which is a social token issuer, and we've done a lot of our own experimentation with really the power of social tokens through our Discord community called RNG, or Random Number Generator. And it's been fascinating. Like, the way I like to describe RNG is like a virtual Soho house for the wonky. So we have our kind of RNG wonky section where we share articles and talk about things like the metaverse and this sort of thing. Like, as an example of that, we have Philip Rosedale, who's the founder of Second Life, talking to us in Big World, which is his new immersive spatial audio platform. And that'll be really interesting tomorrow, because I don't know if you've ever been in one of these spatial audio platforms, but just to have the 3D sound, the birds chirping all around you, and you have all the awkwardness of when you go into a cocktail party, and like, let's say you and I, Jamie, are talking to each other, and we're like these like little avatars talking to each other, and then comes, and in the middle of our conversation, it's like, well, hello, right? You have all that kind of emergent awkwardness in a purely digital context, but layered on top of that foundationally, this world where the virtual currency of that world is energy and entropy. I mean, I know that sounds wonky and like, what the hell does that even mean? But it's one of those things you just have to find out and experience it for yourself. And so my experience with the social token space has been very much the same, right? Like you can have an academic discussion about, oh, these things have no value because, or you can just dive right in and experience what it's like to bootstrap a community from scratch and have, you know, the extrinsic incentives of these tokens guiding whatever it is you would otherwise be doing on the creative, artistic, gaming, or whatever side, and just kind of grow this decentralized co-op out of nowhere, right? And in some sense, some of the relationships I've forged with people I've never met in person in RNG are in some sense much more real than, you know, the relationships like I've had over the last 10 years with people I've known physically but never talked to anymore, right? And so I think this tension is between the digital and the physical, and the digital being more real, and that somehow seems messed up, but actually it's not, because of the scale and leverage that the internet provides is a very common theme that I would say from a macro venture standpoint, there's still a disconnect between where the capital is and those who are on the forefront of building in this purely digital realm. And that's where we just get super bullish, because you know, I'd say there's maybe 3 other gaming funds of our size and kind of footprint, and that's it, right? I mean, contrast that to fintech, where it's like perfect competition 101 for every opportunity, especially with what we're seeing in the late stage of the market. So yeah.
And so are you seeing the role of a VC change? So, you know, one of the interesting things I've encountered when I'm speaking to founders about how they've designed, say, Axie Infinity, is the relationship of the capitalist in the system versus workers. And so, for example, on Axie Infinity's, they talk about this idea of, you know, you can't just be a passive capitalist in the system. If you want your assets to maintain or accrue value, they need to be put to work. And so if you're not going to do that yourself, you need to create jobs for workers. And so this is like one way of onboarding people into the system that perhaps couldn't afford to buy the ticket, so to speak. And so, yeah, how are you thinking about that evolution and your role as a capitalist and a capital provider in these systems, from perhaps more passive to active?
So I would distinguish like 2 roles. One is like my job as a VC to allocate capital to founders, and like I don't want to make that sound more grand than it actually is, because sometimes VCs get into their heads like the idea that they're co-creating with founders. And look, it's not that I'm not involved with portfolio companies. Of course I am, but you know, I think VCs sometimes run too far in overstating their contributions to building, which is the reason why I was keen on trying to build this community myself in RNG, because it's one thing for me, like as a board member, to be like, oh, I think you should do this, this, and this. It's another thing for me to actually discover for myself, like, here's exactly how hard it is to build something from nothing, right? And so, like, I will say the whole RNG experience has really humbled me to a certain degree on like how fascinating yet complicated community dynamics really are. I wrote about it at some length in my Substack article, where, you know, one of our portfolio companies is Playable Worlds, and founded by Ralph Koster, who is this legendary MMO designer. And if you talk to any reasonably gray-haired MMO designers, they'll basically tell you everything we think is new is not actually new at all. And you know, all these lessons have been already learned over the last 25 years. And it's easy to dismiss that, right? Be like, oh no, you're just like a dinosaur. You don't understand the power of tokens or whatever, right? But actually they do, right? And this juxtaposition between extrinsic incentives and intrinsic incentives is really interesting, right? Because if you design a money game that is just about accumulating as many tokens as you can, you're going to attract a certain type of audience, right? Like, and we've seen this most clearly in DeFi, where a lot of these projects are, to state it bluntly, little more than kind of glorified Ponzi schemes. Whereas, if what you really want to do is build a 20-year community and work backwards from there, like, that's pretty interesting. And so when you think about some of these crypto primitives, like liquidity mining, which everyone just seems to universally accept as a great thing, like, wow, look, I can bring $1 million of liquidity to my token. I look at that and I say, wow, I can't believe that Treasury is actually spending so much of its capital and budget on creating an artificially deep market that's going to disappear the moment these extrinsic rewards of supplying liquidity to something like Uniswap go away, right? Because in a properly functioning market, the issue with things like Uniswap is, as a liquidity provider, you are short vol, right? Like, my background, which I didn't talk about so much, I was the COO of FX and emerging markets for 6 years at Goldman and JP. And so I look at a Uniswap contract and I think, wow, is 30 bips is your pro rata share of 30 bips of notional really enough to compensate you for being effectively short a straddle as a liquidity provider, right? Because how these passive AMMs work is, like, I say, I am ready to buy or sell, and you takers can just take liquidity from me, and here's an equal amount of stuff that you can take, right? And so that type of framework works really badly for market makers if there's a lot of volatility. And so, like, the long and short of it is, if we had properly functioning markets, you wouldn't need liquidity mining incentives, because market makers would naturally be incentivized to supply liquidity because they're getting enough from takers in the contract. But what's instead happened is, instead of focusing on the community and the long-term viability of projects, instead we've kind of pumped liquidity artificially by saying, hey, I'm going to give you much more of this token if you supply a two-sided market to this thing, even though my project doesn't actually have any utility whatsoever. Don't worry, you can get these tokens and then you can sell it on the market through that liquidity you've just created. What does that sound like to you? It sounds like a Ponzi scheme to me. So, like, I'm a believer in DeFi on a long-term basis, but I think crypto folks generally have a bit too much of a decentralization will save everything kind of bent. Like, I saw the other day on Twitter this thread about how like, ETH is so much more impactful than Stripe because, whatever arguments. But, like, I think we forget that the internet itself is a huge enabler, and Stripe is powering the essentially GDP of the internet economy, right? And so when we talk about creators, when we talk about the ability of anyone across the globe to make money, things like Stripe, in my opinion, are critical parts of the stack, simply because not everyone is thinking with Bitcoin as the numeraire for daily goods and services, right? So it's not like this either or. And so, bringing it back to gaming for a second, I find it's very much the same thing. Like, crypto gamers are like, oh, I can't believe you've built your game off a blockchain. Like, what are you guys thinking? Whereas my perspective is much more nuanced. It makes sense, particularly in sandbox type of environments, to provide incentives for your community to participate in the upside of the game, but only in the context of certain types of content, right?
Yeah, I mean, Richard, I wish we had another half an hour to talk through. I know we've both got a hard stop on the hour. So just to wrap up, you mentioned you've got this Discord server. I mean, it's been a huge success. Everybody's talking about it. I don't know if you want to just give a couple of quick, easy ways that people can either follow you individually or get involved in that community.
Yeah, so I'm quite reachable in the community. I'm pretty actively involved there. The tag it's discord.gg/RNGlife. I've also written a bit for those who want to do a bit more deep dive into what it's like, and this balance between intrinsic and extrinsic incentives in my last Substack post, which I think you guys can post a link to in the show notes or
Absolutely.
something like that. Yeah, so feel free to reach out. Happy to chat about all this stuff.
Awesome. Richard, thanks so much for coming on. We'll definitely get you on again at some point in the new year to jump into any number of topics we just didn't have time to cover today. But thanks for joining us, Richard.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.